Around this time should be the 1 year anniversary of my appearance on a friend's podcast. My friend Intimate Victor and I had a grand old time discussing topics from freedom of speech all the way to sexuality. I'm going to revisit the idea of freedom of speech because it's something that people and I've been discussing in more and more detail, especially during the new world that we live in. My philosophy on freedom of speech is this: freedom of speech is almost absolute. The only counter-tempering is if the speech actually is hate speech or incites violence. Offending your sensibilities is not hate speech. Offending your sensibilities is not inciting violence. That's what I think. In the marketplace of ideas, I'm a confident person. I can allow everyone and anyone to express fully how they feel and debate them on the merit of their ideas and the ideas alone. I allow everyone, including myself, to have that freedom of speech. What I think is batshit crazy, insane, and overboard is that somebody says something you disagree with, and you then proceed to somehow interfere with their ability to say it, which includes many different forms. I believe that some of them would be doxing people, i.e. revealing their identities and addresses, deplatforming people off of social media, and the list can go on and on and on. When I debated freedom of speech last year, I encountered a problem, which is there's a technical definition that involves government suppressing freedom of speech, and there's a social idea of what freedom of speech is. I'm talking more about the social idea of freedom of speech. So I'm less concerned about the technical definition of governments per se stopping their citizens from expressing ideas. That's something that's obviously part of freedom of speech, but that's something that I want to widen the focus on. Instead of just accepting government's responsibility in freedom of speech, I'm challenging everyone to accept the responsibility of freedom of speech. It ain't just a one-way street of you expressing yourself. It's also allowing other people to express what they want to express, even if you disagree with them. I might disagree with you, but I will fight to the death your right to say whatever you say, again, as long as you are saying something as opposed to spewing hate speech or inciting violence. Now, part of the problem is that people have redefined to, if they personally feel offended by what someone else is uttering, that constitutes hate speech. No. I think we have to reassess our definitions here. Would that mean comedy is hate speech? Comedy is art. Comedy is not necessarily saying things on face value. Comedy is nuance. Comedy is intention. Comedy is funny. So we have to really have a discussion on this, because what's happened is people have taken upon themselves to basically unilaterally define what they consider to be hate speech and then just deplatform people unilaterally without having a due process. I'm defending people I disagree with. For example, Alex Jones. I disagree with a lot of what he says, but I would fight for his right to say it. He's allowed to say it. Now, the difference is that Alex Jones might be a gregarious person. He might say things, and admittedly, my experience consuming his content is very little. But from the examples that I've witnessed, where people say or claim he's being hateful, I think he's just expressing his opinions. If there's an example of him actually inciting violence or engaging in hate speech, I'd welcome anybody to link me directly to the video where he's doing such a thing. Because yes, he has many ideas I disagree with, but I watched him for several hours on Joe Rogan's podcast, his most recent appearance, just like I watched a number of different people, comedians to mixed martial artists. I watched Nikki Glaser, Whitney Cummings, Annie Lederman on Rogan recently. I've also watched Lex Friedman, Solomon, a number of different people, Jocko Willink, and I would say that none of what Alex Jones expressed to me was even in the vicinity of being hate speech or inciting violence. You might disagree with him, and I do disagree with him, but we have to be very careful because now people are wielding the hate speech sword, they're wielding the inciting violence sword, and that's a very slippery slope. Just like Eminem has written in his lyrics before, sure, just tell the judge that I pulled the trigger and I'll get sued. But he's rapping. And what happened to personal responsibility? People can state many ideas. Many ideas. The person acting on them is responsible for their own actions. So I know for myself, nothing Alex Jones tells me would encourage me to go hit someone randomly. Because nobody is in my brain telling me to do things. And if you're such a person, I would think maybe there's some mental weakness on your part. Because why are you doing things because someone else said something on the internet? So there are many ways that we can discuss this, but if we relate someone's words causally to someone else's actions without there being a very clear, direct causation, that's a problem. That's a really big problem. So, live and let live. Anyone can say whatever they want, and being offended on its own doesn't mean that someone has engaged in hate speech or inciting violence. That's my opinion. Now, of course, there are specific nuances, there are specific cases, and again, I welcome anybody to link me to, in the Alex Jones case, a specific example where people think he's doing this, and I will respond to the specific example. But I would mention, again, while I disagree with Alex Jones, I watched him for several hours on Rogan, and at least that particular conversation on Rogan, nothing to me was, again, even in the vicinity of hate speech or inciting violence. Okay. I can only go with the anecdotal examples that I have, but I think listening to someone on a Rogan podcast for several hours, especially because Rogan fosters an open communication environment, I think it's representative enough. I'm not doing a academic paper on Alex Jones, so I'm not doing my full, thorough investigation, nor do I need to. But again, I'm not a platform, so that's what I'm saying. I'm just a normal person assessing from the outside. If you are a platform, a media platform, YouTube, Facebook, all of these other big social media companies that I'm currently now vlogging on, you have a different level of responsibility, and all I would say would be, if people start deplatforming people, if they're doing it based on a commercial reason, I understand, because these social media platforms are private companies that have their terms and conditions, and they're very free to decide what type of person is represented on their platform, because some people earn less ad dollars. Facebook is still a business, YouTube is still a business, so that I understand. But as someone who is demonetized on YouTube, I was once earning and now I'm not, I'd say that there's also a different standard for people who are being monetized on these social media platforms versus people who aren't. Because for people who are not being monetized, there's no such sword that you can wield or such a low barrier. For people who are earning money on the social media platforms, maybe they have more restrictions on them because of the nature of it. But for people who aren't, I think they have different restrictions on them. And again, we have to think about freedom of speech. Despite the fact that YouTube, Facebook, and all of these are not technically government agencies, and they are outside of the classical purview of what we consider to be the responsibilities in a freedom of speech argument, we have to discuss the fact that their role in our lives has become so ingrained and so powerful that they can use their power to negatively impact people in ways where we as a society have yet to fully discuss what the ramifications are. So my main idea, which is something I will probably expand on in future weeks with more research, is that just because you're offended by something doesn't mean that it's hate speech or inciting violence. That's the bottom line. And there's a very technical definition of what hate speech is, and a very technical definition of what inciting violence is. And you feeling sad about what someone says, or you disagreeing with what someone says, or you even being offended by what someone says, it on its own does not make it hate speech or inciting violence. That's the bottom line. That's what I'll leave as me addressing freedom of speech for today. But admittedly, I will probably do some more research because it's been a while since I've engaged in this kind of conversation. I hear the sides all the time through the intellectual dark web, especially through my favorite evolutionary biologist, Bret Weinstein, but that is far from me being able to expound a full treatise on YouTube off the top of my head. As I've mentioned before, and I'll mention again, every single time I go live, I am just talking on the spot. No scripts, no premeditation. So obviously, when I'm live and authentic in that way, I'm prone to making mistakes, and I'm prone to maybe talking myself into corners, talking in circles, and completely contradicting myself. I reserve the right to do that. That is the occupational hazard of going live, and I accept that. But that's also something that I do in good faith to the audience, because I think that the people who follow me understand that that's what happens. And if anyone does follow me for any particular reason, I think that is the particular reason. It's because I am authentic, true, in the moment, and I do make mistakes. And then I'll come back and correct them with more information if need be. So maybe this is a note to myself for me rewatching this vlog. I'll research more into what the current state is, but the reason why I'm talking about it again is because some people have reached out to me discussing the topic of freedom of speech, and this happens to be the 1-year anniversary of the last time I deep dived into freedom of speech, which was about 1 year ago on my friend's podcast, Intimate Victor. Okay. the rest of the time, we dance. the way. This watch, I'm leaving it on because it does analytics on my body mechanics and other health metrics. So I will move it somewhere else next week, but that's why I left it on, because I want to know how many steps did I take, what's the equivalent km run, etc.